Coming up on Insight Weekly, we're discussing one of the wider impacts of COVID 19 global food security. Keep watching to find out how food shortages are affecting each region across the globe. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Insight Weekly, your global security roundup from the past 7 days. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel to be one of the first to watch new episodes every single week. COVID 19 has had a devastating impact across each region of the world. This week, the Intelligence Fusion team are focusing on the impact it has had on the food security situation. We have seen political, civil, and social unrest as a result of food shortages across the world. Firstly, we're heading over to Matt, who's going to take us through the situation in Europe. Matt, do you want to take us away?
Sure, will do. What we've been sort of noticing with food shortages in Europe overall, with what's been happening with COVID-19, is I suppose we'll probably group it under sort of two situations. Well, first up would be sort of access to food supply chains, not so much any kind of issue towards the actual supply chain itself, just the ability for consumers and businesses to access it. For example, at the moment, there's a lot of businesses shut down, which means a lot of people unemployed, and of course, even though with that being the case, demand for basic necessities, of course, will either stay as it is or go up. And over time, as people don't have money to purchase goods or services, there will be the chances of instances of looting, like we've seen in southern Italy, occur, as well as instances of petty crime. In fact, there was an incident only this week in Staffordshire, where a burglar was caught red-handed by police attempting to break into a supermarket during lockdown restrictions in that area. Another issue with when it comes to Europe in terms of food supply would be, I suppose, more of any kind of perceived issues with food supply across Europe. When we saw the COVID-19 outbreak first occur, there was quite a lot of instances of panic buying in supermarkets. Consumers were sort of just worried about access to goods and services and proceeded to essentially buy goods left, right, and centre. And of course, the huge surge in demand, businesses weren't able to immediately meet that demand, and we saw a lot of supermarket shelves being cleared. However, that hasn't really sort of occurred over a long period of time, with measures put in place to mitigate the risks of panic buying. That's helped, and supermarkets have now been able to restock their shelves and provide goods and services that consumers are demanding. And actually, come to think of it, another potential issue for food security issues in Europe over time will be as issues of food security occur in other regions, say in third world regions. I reckon that would lead to an increase in migration from people wanting to get into Europe in order to try and escape issues of food supply elsewhere, which would lead to increases in human trafficking. And as well as for those who do reach Europe and are able to begin living in Europe, that will of course increase the consumer base and lead to more issues with increased demand.
So, Matt, have you seen any specific threats to supply chains of food suppliers in Europe?
Nothing direct at the moment, aside from the panic buying and instances of petty theft. But some things I've actually been keeping in mind is, as time goes by, I think what the main issues for food supply in Europe going forward, when it comes to recovering from COVID-19. The first one will be when it comes to regulations, which will, of course, affect ability for businesses to, first of all, recover and operate. As we've seen with COVID-19, there's been a lot of handouts, in terms of welfare and support to businesses and employees who have been told they can't go to work. When the recovery begins, a lot of governments will be very, very keen to essentially refill the coffers, because they've been spending a massive amount of money, and I dare say in a lot of cases they'll be borrowing money as well. So they'll be very keen to very, very quickly regain the money they've had to spend, which will place a lot of pressure on introducing regulations in terms of increased taxation. And of course, with those kind of regulations, that will of course affect pricing. So, looking forward in terms of recovery on supply chains, there's the risk that any increases in regulation will make it harder for people to essentially buy goods and services, and may lead to inflated costs. Another one, and I want to caveat this with it's a very, very sort of small kind of consideration to keep in mind, is before the outbreak. Of course, there's quite a lot of activity in terms of climate change activism and animal rights activism, where these activists were resorting to, at some points, invading farms and hindering farmers' ability to work, and even stealing livestock. So that is something to keep in mind as a recovery begins to occur. Any kind of activists who are hostile towards meat and dairy industries, there's a chance that they may begin to re-emerge and essentially hinder efforts for any kind of food producer to essentially provide goods goods to supermarkets.
Okay, so I haven't necessarily seen any activists targeting farms, but tariffs in the Asia Pacific region has been really quite a point of contention, as people are getting quite worried now that as countries in Asia Pacific have started to basically say, no, we're not going to export food anymore because we need to look after ourselves first. And what this has done is it's increased the value of exported food. And generally, a lot of countries either have quite large reserves or are fairly self-sufficient. But you've got countries such as Vietnam, who are, I believe, the third biggest rice producer in the world. Once they say that they're going to stop exporting their rice and they're going to take care of themselves first, countries that have typically been reliant on Chinese rice trade suddenly find themselves not only with a shortage of goods, but much more expensive goods as a result. So there's similarities there, I guess, with the massive increase in trade tariffs. But China itself as a country has really been the center of the Asia Pacific's issues after COVID-19. Obviously, China was where COVID-19 began, it's no secret. But finding details as to exactly how China have handled the issues facing their food security has actually been quite tricky. So China's believed to have had quite a large reserve of food before, and the way they handle their food reserves is they essentially ensure that city mayors are responsible for their region's food reserves rather than at a national level. And this means that individual politicians or local authorities are held accountable. So as a result, China has got quite a good food reserve program. However, as a similar vein as what you were saying, Matt, about supply chain, the issue is that right at the bottom of the chain, where in the production stage, you've got Chinese food producers are really struggling to produce the food in the long term. So because workers haven't been allowed to travel, the production has dropped significantly. So yes, whilst China has got these food reserves that I just mentioned, in the intermediate to long term, there's a question of how they're going to replenish these food reserves after their workforce has been out of work for so long. Now, what we've seen is, we've seen this in a lot of countries actually, is we've seen China try to be quite quick to pull back on the lockdowns and allow workers to go back to work. And this presents a few issues in itself. So the first being that the disease might have a second wave that people are talking about, because whilst China is claiming they're having no new infections, this claim has been quite widely disputed. And also, not all provinces are changing their lockdowns at the same rate. So neighbouring provinces, for example, one might be in full lockdown and the other isn't. So there's a big issue right now in China regarding the movement of workers between provinces. And we have actually seen clashes between workers and police in some cases, where these lockdowns have created issues regarding the movement of workers. So China's really been the centre of the Asia Pacific's food security concerns, not only because of their own internal economy and just the economy in general, but also because of the amount of food that they import and export to other countries in the region. So some eyes have started to turn to Chinese foreign policy, and people have started to wonder exactly how China is going to handle any potential food shortages. So in the past, we've seen China offer quite large loans to other countries, and as if the countries can't pay, the Chinese have taken perhaps territory from them as a part of a deal to write off the debts. So some people have started to speak about will China do something similar in order to gain access to fertile farmlands in the Asia Pacific region or even abroad. We're already seeing Chinese businesses growing elsewhere in the world, so it's possible that the Chinese government would try and use their influence in places such as Central Asia and Pakistan to try and increase their agricultural supply chain, because a lot of these countries really do need to diversify just from relying on one or two sources for their food.
So, are there any countries, within your region that are at particular risk of food shortages?
Um, it's hard to single out specific countries, but I would say Asia Pacific, I guess, could be split into two. So you've got the more developed countries such as Korea and Japan, who have much higher GDPs and are and in theory, are much more likely to be able to pay off any tariffs and actually bring in food for their populace. However, the less developed countries are at quite serious risk. So a lot of the farmers in these countries have typically they've relied on almost entirely. In fact, they have relied entirely on the sales of their crops to markets. However, with markets being closed and therefore demand, therefore making it hard for them to sell their crops, they've had to turn to subsistence farming. And this is generally going to have long-term impacts in that these farmers, there's very little chance of them getting any financial assistance from the government, especially in these very hard-to-reach rural areas. So this really does create quite a significant economic problem and could see quite a lot of people falling back into poverty. So these less developed countries are, I would say, at quite significant risk of major food shortages. And also countries that only source their food from one or two other countries. So if you're sourcing the vast majority of your food from one country, if that country then decides it's not going to export food anymore, suddenly you're going to see a huge reduction in the amount of food you're taking in. So I think a lot of countries going forwards will be forced out of necessity to diversify where they get their food from, and force them to start thinking a bit more about relying on just one state. So there's two types of countries really that are at potential very high risk here. So ones that only have a few sources of food, and others that are much less developed than perhaps Korea, Japan, or even China.
Yeah. So, you mentioned, the impact of food shortages within your region, and those that are particularly vulnerable. I think the risk or impact of food shortages was highlighted this week, by the World Food Programme, who warned of more than 30 countries experiencing famine. In the 2020 Global Report on Food Crises, they named 35 countries globally as having experienced food crises in 2019. 23 of these countries were in Africa alone. So the report cited things like, governance, infrastructure, poor health, weather extremes, conflict or insecurity, and economic shocks as contributing to, or are driving factors behind food shortages or food security. The role or significance of each of these drivers, I think, varies from country to country. In terms of the COVID-19 outbreak, we're already seeing, the impact, the economic impact that the outbreak is having in Africa. The closure of borders has led to increased prices, which has been attributed to a lack of supply or fears of falling supply. While we haven't seen protests linked to the price of food, we have seen protests by vendors contesting the closures of markets. This was the case in Angola over the weekend, where about 500 people protested the closure of a market in Kalakwembe. There have been similar protests in Kenya, also around markets. I think the income of lower income households, especially those who live hand to mouth, have been heavily impacted by the COVID-19 response. And if prices continue to rise, there will, I can see there be protests because people will lack purchasing power. While many governments have put measures in place to try and absorb the impact, if this support doesn't reach lower income households or those working in the informal economy, this will affect purchasing power and lead to civil unrest. There have been a number of demonstrations and cases of looting of trucks and stores in South Africa, especially over the past week, by people complaining of a lack of food. Protests in Cape Town are occurring in impoverished areas, in Cape Town, such as Mitchell's Plain, Delft, Kailicha. So there have been similar protests over food distribution in Nigeria, though not yet, as widespread. Any prolonged civil unrest linked to food security will likely lead to further pressure on governments. And if the COVID-19 crisis is not sort of managed well, I think we will see more attacks on businesses and looting. I think we are likely to see increased livestock theft, and this will then lead to increased risk of communal tension and fighting.
Could food shortages lead to political unrest, Viraj?
Absolutely. I think prolonged unrest will lead to increased anti-government sentiment, which could then lead to anti-government demonstrations. With Sudan, food shortages were a key driver in anti-government demonstrations.
Do you see any other threats or any other consequences on food security?
I think the two that stand out are natural disasters such as flooding, and locust invasions in East Africa. The UN claimed that the desert locust outbreak, will be 20 times as worse as the last outbreak. So the response to COVID-19 has slowed, the response to locust invasions, and such as bans on gatherings and the closure of borders.
Yeah, so you've talked quite a bit about protest within your region and how food shortages could lead to more or various types. I think in my region in the Americas, at least in the last few weeks and this week ongoing, we've seen quite a bit of protest in Honduras and Bogota in Colombia. These linked to food shortages. So in Honduras, we've seen these protests quite focused around kind of the area of San Pedro Sula, the economic hub of the country, and its capital, Tegucigalpa. And these protests have been because people within Honduras are part of quite the informal economy. And so because of COVID-19 and the lockdown restrictions, a lot of people haven't been able to go to work or factories have laid off workers. And so people have been unable to afford food. The government was meant to supply food parcels to families in order to kind of survive this period. However, it hasn't been enough, and so people have been protesting quite often. These protests have involved road blockages, as well as so earlier this week we saw bus drivers, bus owners, and fare collectors protest on the highway south of Tegucigalpa. Because they were demanding that either the government provide food so they can survive, or they lift restrictions so that they're able to go back to work. We've seen similar protests in Colombia as well, where people have asked to go back to work. And the protests that we've seen around Bogota regarding food shortages have been particularly in the southern neighborhoods around Ciudad Bolivar. And these protests have involved people waving red flags outside their homes to show that they're out of food, basically, and are hungry. These populations in these neighborhoods are also the poor neighborhoods, and also the people that are, such as Honduras, are part of the informal economy. So I feel that the extension of restrictions regarding COVID-19, whether lockdown measures or curfews, will likely lead to these protests to continue as people are still unable to go to work, and will likely have a potential to turn violent as people become more desperate as they're unable to get food. These protests, such as in the case of Honduras, like I said, are compounded by layoffs from factories. And some of these factories supply clothing or auto parts for brands in North America, such as in the United States. And so there's a chance that as the situation becomes more desperate, these factories and these industries are targeted by protesters as they're unable to work and so unable to afford food. What we might also see based on these protests as they turn more violent are more instances of looting or cargo theft or cargo robberies on highways. And we've seen in Honduras threats of looting being made in certain municipalities, and the authorities have asked to investigate this. So we're seeing the population getting quite hungry, and with a lack of food, unrest is likely to become a growing problem in those countries. The collapse of these economies could lead to certain issues, as Matt mentioned, potentially migration. So we've seen unrest in Mexico from migrants in detention centers wanting to be deported back to countries like Honduras, because at that time they felt that they had a better chance of surviving COVID-19 being free in Honduras rather than being in detention centers overcrowded in Mexico. But I think as these populations in Honduras become more impacted by food shortages or by a collapse of the economy due to COVID-19 restrictions, there's a potential to see more migrant caravans going towards Mexico and towards the United States. This would put pressure on Mexico to again safeguard their southern border to limit the impact that it would have on the Mexican local economy. Finally, there's a chance that also these food shortages could cause xenophobia. So in regards to Bogota in Colombia, prior to these protests that have been focused on food shortages, a few weeks back, we saw protests regarding neighborhoods who were against the government using sports centers within those neighborhoods as facilities to house vulnerable populations, primarily Venezuelan migrants. So if these populations in already impoverished neighborhoods see Venezuelan migrants as receiving preferential treatment from the government, there's a chance that we see these populations turning against the migrants as well.
So are there any other areas where you're seeing these protests occur?
Yeah, so in regards to Colombia, we've not only seen them in Bogota, but we've also seen such protests in Medellin, in the northwest, and we've also in neighboring countries such as Venezuela. We've also seen quite a bit of protest. These protests have not only been about food, but they've also been about a lack of water, about a lack of fuel, a lack of domestic gas for people to cook at home. And so it's part of the protest that we see in Venezuela. But one thing that's interesting regarding the food supply in Venezuela is that these protests, particularly those regarding fuel, have also been undertaken by farmers and agricultural producers because they need the fuel to harvest their crops and to get their crops to market for the population. So Venezuela is not only dealing with problems with their healthcare system due to COVID-19, but they're also seeing the lack of fuel from their fuel industry collapsing due to sanctions and due to a lack of taking care of infrastructure, impacting food security because now people can't get fuel.
It's interesting that with regards to these protests, the issues seem quite wide-ranging. I was just wondering, could these protests have any ramifications with regard to the criminal landscapes of those countries?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's a chance, and it's likely that certain criminal groups might actually be strengthened because of these food shortages and because of the unrest within the populace. There's opportunities presented where the governments have shortcomings for criminal groups to come in and support the populations. So in the case of Honduras, there's a chance and there's opportunities for the likes of MS-13 or Barrio 18 to come in and support the local populations. And we've already seen them in regards to Honduras enforce lockdowns and curfews within their communities that they control to ensure that COVID-19 doesn't spread. So they already have a certain power within the communities that they're in. And so the shortcomings of the Honduran government will allow these criminal groups to take over certain territories and support the population and gain their support. And we've seen similar actions by criminal cartels in Mexico, like the Cartel del Golfo, who's we've seen deliver food parcels and basic necessities to more rural communities. And we've also seen that in Brazil with criminal gangs within the communities they control. So there's opportunities for these criminal groups to come in and handle the situation in a way to where they can take advantage of government shortcomings, and that will expand their power, and so that might have ramifications for post COVID-19 settings.
Thank you, team, for another comprehensive and insightful analysis into the COVID-19 global pandemic there. Don't forget you can follow all the latest updates and alerts from coronavirus using our live, free and interactive map. I'll pop a link in the post so that you can check that out. And don't forget also to like, share and comment on the video. Please let us know what your key takeaways were, and also ask our analysts some questions for next week. You may just feature on next week's episode. Until then, stay safe.